What's up, guys? Welcome back. I'm going to be doing a support guide today. Hopefully you guys enjoy this video. I appreciate everybody that's been watching the previous videos. This one's going to be a little bit different of a format because I don't play support as much, so it's a little bit harder for me to find the items. So I kind of already have all the heroes built already, and I'm just going to tab in and out for each hero. To start, we're going to go with Dekker. To start with Dekker, usually you go, in my opinion, I think Sanctify or Tranquility is usually the best start. In some matchups, you might want to go Silentium, which basically allows you to silence somebody and then get a longer CC chain, specifically against heroes like Crunch or Greystone, for example, where having a little bit of extra CC might make a lot of the difference. The reason I'm not recommending anything like Riftwalkers is because I don't think most people can play, especially not new players or something like that. I wouldn't really recommend that kind of play style. I would definitely recommend the more defensive Sanctification or Tranquility options. The reason I tend to go Sanctify over Tranquility is because Hexbound doesn't give any HP, so going Hexbound as your first item can be a little susceptible to dying if you go Tranquility first item. So usually I go Sanctification. Second item, I will usually almost always go Raiment of Renewal on Dekker. This just gives you a lot of HP, some extra mana, and some cooldown. The regen is just a nice secondary passive, allowing you to be a little bit more aggressive. This really stops you from being the main focus in the team fight. If you go a little bit too damage heavy or no HP heavy, then you can really be focused in a team fight and just die before you even get a chance to really CC people. The third item is typically Time Warp. The reason you go Time Warp is because it kind of lets you go above the cooldown cap. So if you don't know, the more haste you have, the less valuable the haste is. So you actually get diminishing returns. However, the Time Warp passive allows you to go over this cooldown basically because it's unaffected. So this allows you to throw more stuns out, more cages, more beam slows. All this really useful on Dekker, obviously as a support, and it could just be really nice to allow you to throw the stun ball as an engage and then still have it up for a peel option during the team fight. Your last two options, as for most supports, will kind of be a flex option. Typically, games don't really go long enough for you to really get this far into your build, or at least get a full fourth or fifth item. Solid options are Galaxy Greaves is a fantastic option if you want a little bit more of a bounce around a defensive option. You can also go a Stonewall / Unbroken Will. You'll see this very common in the rest of the support builds, as they are just very strong defensive options for magical and physical, and they give you solid stats to round out your build since you're not really a damage dealer. One option that's not actually on here is Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker is another solid option for a magical defensive item. If you feel like you can get away with a little bit doing a little bit more damage, a Spellbreaker in the 4th slot or 5th slot can also be very valuable. Sometimes I will find myself building something like this. This does make you a little bit more of a threat to enemy backline as well, since you kind of have 2 damage items here. One thing to note is if you do need anti-heal, you put it into this 3rd slot instead of the Time Warp, and you just cut the Time Warp out to go a Tainted Scepter. The reason you go Tainted Scepter is it's just better stats for Dekker than the Tainted Totem. Since you don't apply healing, you don't actually benefit from the second passive, whereas you do actually do a decent amount of damage with Tainted Scepter, since you have the flat pen and you have pretty high base scaling on some of your abilities. Moving on to the next support, we're going to talk about Belica. I'm going to kind of do the enchanters and the backline supports first, and then we'll go into the more aggressive supports after, since a lot of them are very similar in their builds. So for Belica, rather than go Sanctification, you tend to go Tranquility or Silentium. These give you power as opposed to Sanctification giving you HP, which Belica has a little bit more kill potential as a traditional caster, which makes it a little bit more valuable. It also gives her valuable mana regen, which is really important as opposed to the health regen that you get from the Sanctification. First item you typically go is Hexbound Bracer. You just want your cooldowns up as fast as possible, and you get the mana regen, allowing you to spam things like the drone without having to back super often. And then you can also use your right click for poke, whereas in mid you'd be using it to clear the wave and then getting mana refund. In support you don't really do that, since you don't want to push all the time. So you can use it for a lot more for poke, and it's also a very cheap item. The next item you go is typically, this is actually in the wrong slot. Again, you go Raiment, or you can actually get a time warp in the second item. If you are kind of winning a little bit, a time warp second is completely acceptable and is fine in the second slot, or you can go at third slot, very similar to Dekker, where you go raiment into the time warp, and then if you need anti-heal, you can also slot that in the second or the third slot and kind of flex it around with the time warp and the raiment. Last items are usually, again, the Unbroken and the Stonewall. It depends on the game or what you want to do. Alternative options that you can always go into, maybe you aren't liking the raiment or something like that, you can definitely try a Dynamo in the second slot. It just allows you to do a little bit extra damage off your knockup and help your team out a little bit. You can also go Galaxy Greaves if you want to be a little bit more active on rotations, for example. It can give you benefits in that regard since you can walk a little bit faster. So your build could look something like this if you want to go a straight defensive build. But as somebody like Belica, I tend to like to be a little bit more aggressive and go for the more aggressive build. Sometimes I'll even find myself doing something like this, where I go the raiment in the third slot, and then you actually end up teching into a Tainted Scepter for the double damage in the late game. And then very similar to Dekker, you can also get a Spellbreaker at some point in the build if you need it as well for some magical defense. Something like this is also completely acceptable. This is definitely more of like a Belica and a Dekker thing. You don't really do this on any of the other characters, but Spellbreaker is also another fantastic item. And if you really want to, and you're really feeling yourself, and you want to go like a more damage heavy build, like you're gonna try to carry the game, you can also go all three of the damage items, and then just kind of rely on raiment and hexbound to keep your cooldowns active and just continually CC people. And then Silentium, very similar to Dekker. The only difference being Belica has low CC to begin with, since it's all reliant on the knockup. It might get a little bit more value on Dekker than on some other characters, but if you are against like a very assassin heavy comp like a Fang Mao or a Kalari, it can be a lot more valuable than on somebody like Dekker, who has other tools to deal with them. Dekker having her stun ball and her ultimate, Belica only having her stun. So just something to think about. You can go either or. Silentium is more matchup dependent. Obviously, if you're against the Fae, you're going to buy Reclamation on most of the supports. That is just a 1 or 2 hero specific things, so I don't feel like it's worth really mentioning too much, as in the majority of games you will have Tranquility or Silentium. Moving on to the next support, we get into some of the healers. We're going to start with Muriel. Not really a healer, but she does heal a lot with Wellspring, which is going to be her first item. Typically you go Tranquility. Sometimes you go Silentium. Again, if you are against these like Crunch, Greystone matchups, it can get value, but not as much as you might get on like Dekker or Belica. Usually your option is Tranquility for the extra heal, or you go Sanctification. Sanctification is actually really strong on Belica, or not Belica, Muriel. Some people might not know this, but if you pop your Sanctification shield, you actually get 60% tenacity. But the thing with Muriel is you add a shield on top of that because of Muriel shielding. So you can pop your Sanctification, then pop your shield, and that entire time the Sanctification shield is being covered by the Muriel shield, you still have that 60% tenacity, which can give you a lot of value, especially when you're trying to peel for somebody. So that's why Sanctification gets a lot of value on her. But if you can also go Tranquility, and there's nothing wrong with that. As for your first item, you go Wellspring. It just gives you a heal on your abilities, which basically means you shield and then you heal. So now you're kind of giving somebody double value whenever you shield them. And it also increases your healing and shielding, which then allows you to get larger shields and more healing from Wellspring itself. Very strong item, one of the most broken items in the game, to be honest, and definitely is one of the reasons Muriel is considered solid right now. Second and third, depending on whether or not you anti-heal or not, you can get Tainted Totem in the second slot. This just allows you to buy anti-heal for yourself as well as your team, and then gives you cooldown and some mana regen, which is pretty needed on Muriel as you are a support. The alternative is Crystal Tier. This just basically increases not only your own magical power and haste, but your teammates. And yet, even if they're not magical damage dealers, for example, maybe you have a Twin Blast who does physical damage, he still has some magical scaling, but you also still give them the haste, so you get value. If you have a more magical heavy comp, you can get extra value, but it also increases your healing and shielding. It gives you some haste as well, which is very valuable. These are the two main core items, I would say. Totem is dependent on the game. Let's say you don't need Totem, you can always go a Raiment third item. Raiment makes Muriel very tanky just because you're popping the Raiment as well as the Wellspring, and then you have shields on top of that. And so while they're dealing with your shields, they are regenning you with Raiment, which gives you a lot of value, which makes it a very solid item in the third or fourth slot. An alternative item to go would be Wind Collar. It's very strong on Muriel, I would say. It's probably the strongest on Muriel out of any of the other shielding and healing characters. It can be very good, but it is a little bit situational, and sometimes you aren't able to get it. For example, if you need anti-heal, your build would probably look something like this. And then last item, you probably need a hard defense item. If you're diving in, if you're playing more backline, then you would get the Wind Collar. But if you're ulting frontliners, I would typically tend to go towards a Unbroken or a Stonewall, since they have to kill you first in order to kill your teammates, otherwise you just shield them. So typically these are going to be your last two items, unless you can get away with sitting in the back line and you are not ulting into the front line. So it just depends on the game. It also stops you from kind of getting picked, especially by like assassins or something like that, or getting, you know, like Riktor comboed before, you know, the tenacity from Unbroken can give you the ability to get out with your ultimate if you need to. But again, there's nothing wrong with something like this, depending on the game. These two are just options in case you need a hard defensive last couple slots. Now we're going to go to Phase. Phase is very similar to Muriel, almost identical. The only difference is that you go Galaxy Greaves in the second slot. The reason you go Galaxy Greaves is because you can jump around and you can hover with your beam. You can also pull people over ledges like the Fangtooth wall, for example, and things like that, as well as jump up onto the ledge in mid lane, which could be really nice. You typically go Tranquility for the same reason you go Tranquility on Muriel, but if you need to, you can also go Sanctification or Silentium, depending on the game. If you're getting hard focused and you're getting like CC'd really heavily for whatever reason, let's say they have like a Rampage and he's just jumping on you, throwing the rock at you, and they're trying to combo you, Sanctification might get a little bit more value since you get the tenacity. If you're against a little bit more of a burst heavy comp or a poke heavy comp, Tranquility and the mitigation / shield that it gives might be better. If you're against like a Crunch or something like that, or Greystone, Silentium could also get a lot of value. I would say Sanctification is a little bit more of a defensive option, whereas Tranquility is a little bit more of a, your team fight is over and you are just resetting before you engage again, or you're just poke trading with the healing that you have. Crystal Tear and Wellspring are the same thing as Muriel, just really good healing options, and they benefit your team greatly. Phase already gives you cooldown with her ultimate, so having that plus Crystal Tear can be really nuts in the late game and give you like an insane amount of haste. Raiment, a good defensive option that just gives you HP, which is effective value against physical and magical characters, and then also gives you the regen combined with your own regen, which can be really nice. Tainted Totem, another great slotted option. If you can get away with it, you can go at fourth without having to go a defensive option. Or if you need anti-heal earlier, you can go it in the third slot instead of the Crystal Tier and then get Crystal Tier later, or just cut it all together to go some defense options. A good option. The only thing is that it doesn't increase your healing, so typically you want to get it with the Crystal Tier if you can, even if you have to go something like this. And then you have the last slot, which you can kind of flex. You have the Wind Collar if you're not really getting focused at all and you're just kind of running around. You can use this as a nice little movement speed boost. You can also go into any of the hard defense items, whether that be Stonewall or the Unbroken in the last two slots, if you need them, and anti-heal is not relevant in that game. Next up we have Narbash. Narbash is pretty straightforward. He kind of has like one good build, I would say. He doesn't use Wellspring like the other healers as well, just because his heal is almost always active. But it can still be like an okay option if you do want to go it. I didn't really put it in the build, but it is like an option if you want it later. But you are a little bit more of a frontline champ than the other heroes, so like you get a little bit less value since you need to be a little bit tankier. Typically you go Sanctification, sometimes you'll go Leaf Song. The reason for Sanctification is because you want to ult with True Silver Bracelet, which then allows you to channel your ult completely, because you get the CC immunity from the True Silver. So when you ult, you activate Sanctification during your ultimate to put the Sanctification shield over the True Silver shield, making you CC immune the entire duration of both shields. which basically allows you to full channel the ult and get a large knockup in the team fights. Your first item is usually Crystal Tier. It just increases your healing and shielding, as well as gives you some cooldown and mana regen, which is really impactful on Narbash, as you are spamming mana with your heal most of the game. True Silver can be a flex into the third spot. If you need it early, just to get your ult off, you can definitely go at second. If you don't, you can go at third, and you can get Tainted Totem. Tainted Totem is just another mana regen item, gives you HP and cooldown. All great stats for Narbash, and then it also gives your team healing. If you don't need that, you can go into a Wind Caller, which does basically the same thing. The only difference is that you give your team movement speed randomly every 8 seconds. This is kind of hard. The movement speed passive is kind of awkward to use if you have your heal on at all times, but it is still nice to just kind of have the stats from it, and the movement speed never hurts, especially since you already have a movement speed in your kit, which can be really synergistic and give your team a lot of mobility to either engage or disengage in team fights. But typically you want to go the Tainted Totem in the second or third slot if you can. Last two slots are again kind of similar to some of the previous supports. Raiment, if you only need like one defensive option or you're not really sure what to get. If you have a specific option or you're getting focused, Unbroken or Stonewall can be really solid options as hard defense items. But if you can get away with it, I think your ideal build is looking something like this. Maybe you even get the Raiment last, provided that you can get away with it. Another thing to note is that True Silver does give you magical defense. So generally, if you aren't sure what to get, you could just end up getting a physical defense item and just call it a day, since you will have physical and magical defense, and then you kind of just go some healing with a Raiment. So this is what I would say the typical build would look like for Narbash, and you're just trying to, again, spam your heal, spam your movement speed, and spam your stuns. Going along, where you have Riktor. Riktor's kind of like a flex pick, probably the most flexible hero in the game at the moment. In my opinion, he kind of plays jungle, solo, and support really well. His support build is very different, not even like that different, but it is different than his other build. You are a frontline tank hero, so you do kind of go the Riftwalker / Sanctification. The Sanctification is if you are kind of getting engaged on a lot and you're kind of being a little bit more defensive. The Riftwalker is a little bit more proactive. You can Riftwalker into a big ultimate by pulling everybody into you, and then you get like a 3-man, 4-man Riktor ult, and you just instant win the team fight if you are able to get it. The way you would build items is Hexbound Bracer first. Another potential option is the Dynamo. I like to go Hexbound just because it gives you more cooldown, but Dynamo can also be nice because you get the HP. It depends on how aggressive you want to be in the lane and how comfortable you are using your mana. I would say for the average player, Hexbound is a little bit better. Raiment being your second item, you are a frontline hero, so you do kind of need good defensive stats, and the best defensive stat you can get early is a lot of HP. 600 HP is usually better than 35 protections or something you're going to get from other items. Your last 3 items are kind of situational depending on the game. If you need anti-heal, you can actually skip the Raiment and then go a double anti-heal Tainted build, where you go Tainted Guard, and then you can kind of determine whether or not you need magical defense. If you do, you can go Bastion. If not, you can then go into the Raiment in the third slot. Your 3 magical options is the Bastion for double Tainted if you need it. If you don't need that, Unbroken is typically your go-to magical defense item. If you feel like you're kind of snowballing a little bit and you want to be a little bit more aggressive or increase your team's damage, because let's say you have like a Countess jungle with a mage, and then you have like a Sevarog offlane, so you're 4 magicals, a Flux Matrix can be really valuable in that type of situation. It also lowers tenacity. Some people might not know that, so if they have a lot of Unbrokens, you can get this to counter that, and then they get CC'd for the full combination, full duration of your combo. Typically, I would say most of my builds would look something like this, but again, you can also flex the Dynamo in the first slot. It just depends on how comfortable you are with your mana. And then Stonewall is also a fantastic last option slot item. It just depends. Typically, again, you don't really get past 3.5 items in most games, so usually the main 2 that you want to have cooldown on them, which is Hexbound and Renewal, and then Dynamo as an option if you want it. Steel is pretty much the exact same thing. There's really no difference. between Steel and Riktor. The only difference being that Riktor is a little bit more, Riktor's a little less mobile, so Steel has a little bit more opportunity to create space and utilize things like Flux Matrix. The other difference being that Steel does not rely on mana as much as Riktor. Riktor's hook costs like 120 mana, I believe, level 1, which is an insane cost considering his mana pool is about like 280. Whereas Steel's a little bit, he has a small mana pool to it, 300, but his right click only costs about 60, so it takes a little bit more usage to kind of lose the value. So typically you go Dynamo just because it gives you the HP and whatnot, and you're going to be dashing in and do a right click, something like that. You're going to be ult comboing people. Raiment, fantastic item again. HP gives you the cooldown, a little bit of extra base mana, which allows you to then spam your abilities. Riftwalker and Sanctify, very similar to Riktor. You can Riftwalker into a right click into an ult combination, or use it to create space or close the distance so that you can get into range to ult, things like that. Sanctify if you're being a little bit more defensive and just trying to peel as opposed to be the frontline space creator / setup for your team. Or if you're just trying not to get CC'd when you go in. Let's say you dash in, you can pop this, get the tenacity, guarantee that you basically get your ult off without being able to be comboed, especially effective against characters like Riktor, or maybe they have like a Narbash that's going to thunk you into like a Rampage Rock or something like that. The tenacity can be really nice. As for your last 3 items, the Flux Matrix is a great flex item just because you have a lot of CC, so reducing their tenacity is really nice. Gives you the cooldown, a little bit of magical defense, which you don't get in the first 2 items that you have, and then it also gives you the HP, and then it also lastly increases your team's damage, which is always nice, but not the priority on the item. You also have the option to double flex the tainted items in these slots, very similar to Riktor. You can kind of flex them in any of the 2nd to 4th slots, depending on the game or what you think is the best. If you're against like a Narb or something like that, or Countess Chimera, you might want to tech into the anti-heal items more frequently. It just depends on the game. Alternatively, you do have the 2 hard defense items, Unbroken Will and Stonewall. They're probably just the 2 best single defense items in the game, and they are always very solid. If you are getting to the point where you're 5 items, this is probably the best build for you, unless you are against healing, in which case you would then have a Tainted Guard or a Tainted Bastion somewhere in here. And then lastly, this one might be a little bit of a surprise for most people. Zarus is actually pretty solid in the support role. He's the only like non-traditional support, I guess, that I'm going to include. I'm not going to include things like Rux or like Howitzer or Faye or anything like that, because I don't think that they are actually super valuable. Whereas Zarus, I think, actually has a lot of potential in the support role. So typically, you go Leaf Song. The reason that you go Leaf Song is because it gives you the cooldown. Sanctification is another good option, but Leaf Song gives you the cooldown, which can really allow you to kind of use your presence in the lane by poking and using your Q often and ulting as much as you can, which is kind of what you want to do. You kind of want to start caging people. If you can scale with your ult, you can be a lot more effective and actually go into some of the bruiser tank items, such as Citadel or Tainted in the later slots. I like to personally start like a health gem, and then depending on how the start goes in the game, like how do I feel the game is going, off my first back, I will go either Dynamo or I will go Fire Blossom in the first slot. If you go Fire Blossom, you can be a lot more aggressive and you can actually just start out trading people, especially ADCs and junglers. Zarus has a lot of good scaling with his right click. It does double damage when they're below 20%, and it's a very low cooldown, so you can actually kind of abuse how he plays a little bit. It also allows you to invade jungle camps a little bit easy as Zarus, but it's very situational. If you don't think you can get that solidly, just go Dynamo and go a more defensive build where you're kind of stunning people and kind of creating space for your team. Second item, you will typically go a Raiment. If you need cooldown no matter what in your first 2 items. So if you go the Fire Blossom, you're 100% going the Raiment. If you're going the Dynamo, you could potentially flex into something like a Citadel second, as opposed to the Raiment, just because the Dynamo gives you the cooldown that the Fire Blossom does not. Third item, you're almost always going to go Unbroken Will unless you need anti-heal, in which case you would have something like this, which is a completely acceptable build. You might even have the Dynamo in that first slot. Again, these are just flexes. depending on the game. And then you can go the double tainted items if you need them in the early game. Usually I will try to go the raiment if I don't need them specifically against a Narbash or like a phase or something like that in the lane. The last items are usually like the Stonewall is a good option. If you want to be a little bit more aggressive, typically I like to go a Citadel at some point, just because you are able to scale off your ultimate a little bit. If you can get a couple stacks and you can get a little bit of extra power from your ultimate, it can be really strong, and you can actually start to be kind of a damage threat in the team fights and start actually kind of boxing up the enemy ADC or the enemy mid laner and putting a lot of pressure on the enemy backline. As you aren't a traditional like peel support, you're more of a frontline aggressive support. Another option, if you want to go a little bit more damagey, let's say the game is going in a favorable position, usually this is enough defense and you can actually get a Tainted Blade last item, which still gives you the anti-heal, but it also gives you the cooldown and the power that you might need to actually deal some damage to people and finish off those kills, specifically for carrying the game. Another last item option is a Mutilator. This is very game specific, and if you feel like you have to carry the game and you need to be in a position to actually kill people, Mutilator gives you a lot more kill potential than something like Tainted Blade most of the time. But it is a very situational item, and I would not recommend it in most builds, but it is just an option. So this is typically what I would say most of my builds would look like. But it just depends on the game, obviously. Again, if you need anti-heal, it might look a little bit more like this. Or even you could get, let's say you're snowballing the early game, you want to get a little bit more of a damage item, you can get a Tainted Blade second, and then you are still like a damage threat, but you have the anti-heal for your team, and then you go Tainted Bastion for a little bit of anti-heal, and then last two items you get some double physical defense, whether that be Stonewall and Citadel. So you could even have something built like this, which is still very solid. This build does lack a little bit of extra cooldown that you might lose from Raiment, but you could always, again, tech in the Dynamo, and then your Dynamo tainted into some hard defense, which can be really strong and is just something worth trying. And if you haven't, it is pretty fun, and in my opinion, probably my favorite support to play right now. But that's it for this video. I appreciate everybody that's been watching these how to build videos. If you like them, let me know. I do want to do more content like this. It's just kind of hard to really figure out what to do and how to do it effectively. I will have a tier list video probably tomorrow, if not later tonight, ranking all the heroes in my opinion and their strength. Obviously, for some of these builds, it's very situational, but I will do my best to put them in the most effective order to help you guys kind of pick what's the top and what's not the top. But again, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon, and I will see everybody in the next video.